As I said before the 5 o'clock news, special guest this morning is Tim Blair, of course, a columnist with the Daily Telegraph. Mixes a nice mix of, well, I find anyway, a nice mix of political observation with wit and humour. It's something that I think often goes well together and lends itself to each other. But recently Tim wrote a wonderful piece, among many he's written, to do with the true believers. A term that is, of course, coined by Paul Keating about 20 years ago after his, some would say, surprise, some would say deserved election win. But, of course, the true believers are getting a little bit anxious. It seems that they are in a crowd of ever-diminishing popularity and number. And another day, another opinion poll. This time it's the Fairfax-Nielsen poll showing Labor's share of the vote down again to 47%. The 53% for the coalition on a two-party preferred basis. We'll look at polls, we'll look at the true believers, we'll look at Labor's base, and we'll look at what some of them have to say when they get free rein on social media. Tim Blair's here to discuss all of that. Good morning, Tim.
Hey, Michael, how are you going, mate?
I'm very well. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Not a problem.
Great piece. You say that Labor's support, although it seems to be looking rather sick, you say it'll never probably fall below 25%.
Well, they're lucky enough to have that solid core of, as you pointed out, what Paul Keating described as your true believers. But the thing that's confusing from a non-true believer perspective, looking at these people, is what do they truly believe in? If you believe in Labor, if Labor is the core of your belief, well, you believe in Labor when they have a more humane refugee policy. You believe in Labor when they send all the refugees to Papua New Guinea. You believe in Labor when they have a policy to liberate financial regulations, and you support them when they do the opposite, as has happened over the last thing. It seems the only thing the true believers really believe in is Labor, which doesn't make a great deal of sense.
Like an analogy I think you made in your piece, they seem to support people who just wear a certain type of shirt. If you're going to the football, of course, at the weekend we'll have a lot of football on. You know, you can back the green and the red, or you can back the black and the gold. It's not really the people wearing the outfit or how well they play. It's just the jersey strip, isn't it? Yeah,
well, that was Jerry Seinfeld's famous observation that you're basically booing or cheering for shirts, and you support one guy in a particular team, he changes team, and suddenly, boo, bad shirt.
Yes, disloyal, bastard.
Exactly.
Yes.
and so your true believers tend to believe more in the costume than in the content, which is just a curious thing for people who are obviously very politically passionate. It's a curious thing for people like that to do.
Yeah, what is the psychology? I mean, I'm not a trained psychologist. I don't know if you are either, Tim. But what's the psychology, do you think, behind this? I mean, as you say in your piece, and you write it very clearly, you say, look, the so-called true believers are actually a pretty ill-named mob, because you say that they don't actually really believe in anything, or anything much at all, besides, brand Labor, because you say, as you pointed out, you say if Labor relaxes laws on asylum seekers, they'll still vote for them. If Labor sends all asylum seekers to PNG, locks them up behind a fence, well, they'll vote for that. If Labor sacks a male PM, they'll vote Labor. If Labor feel like affirmative action's needed and they get a female PM, they'll still vote Labor. If they're fiscal conservatives, they'll vote for them. If they're socialists with economics, they'll vote for them. What is this attachment? Is it just because Daddy and Granddaddy voted this way, or?
No, I think it's more, Labor does have a kind of a religious aspect to it, which is curious for a party that's often led and features so many atheists.
Well, they seem to be worshipping quite heavily at the altar of climate change.
That was one of their, that's one of the top 10. But Labor itself, the party, you have religious iconography is at the core of Labor. You have the light on the hill. You have the tree of knowledge. You have all of these, well, they're basically substitutes for an actual religion, I guess.
You've got St. Goff.
Yeah, St. Goff. And people who address each other as comrade and so on. It does get a bit weird. But I've got members of my own family who were very much caught up in Labor and adored Labor, and they treated it as almost as a substitute faith. They weren't particularly religious outside of Labor, but within Labor they were, it was all for the party, and it was all, very much a faith-based kind of structure. It's a strange thing. I mean, all parties, though, have people who vote for them no matter what.
Oh, yes, yes.
But the difference is, I think, with Liberal and National supporters who tend to vote Liberal and National, they generally do it because their parents did it, and it's just a generational thing, and that's how they vote. They don't have the same religious loyalty, if you like, that you see among your really hardcore Labor true believers. It's a different sort of thing. No one imbues the Liberal Party with the same quasi-religious kind of dressing up that you get with Labor, which is I think is perfectly appropriate. You don't want a political party to have all that sort of baggage, as advantageous as it might be to Labor. It's just a not healthy thing. You really should be looking more at policies than at the package.
Of course, though, when it comes to policies, Labor's had different policy positions or binary oppositions on about every key issue this election, so they're certainly covering the base. But when we look at the true believer notion, the coalition supporters, lifelong, the Labor lifelong true believers, would it be fair to say that you could almost understand the diamond and pearl set supporting the coalition because election after election, coalition policies do tend to favour the business community, do tend to be sympathetic to the wealthy, do seem to be very much keyed into the aspirational class, and if in power, they better their position. Whereas it would be pretty hard to argue that the last 6 years have seen an improvement in the life of the average manufacturing person or person toiling the soil or working over hot steam vent at a factory. In many respects, they've lost their jobs.
In a lot of ways, the last 6 years have been psychological. Just back on the subject of psychology, have been psychologically damaging for the true believers. If you look at what they write online, they seem to be becoming a little bit unhinged, especially in the last few weeks.
Yes.
September 8 is going to be a fascinating morning for these people. I wouldn't be trying to book any appointments at the shrinks. There might be a bit of a backlog. Actually, there was once in the US following George Bush's second election in over John Kerry. I think it was the New York Times reported a massive upswing in psychiatric appointments throughout New York City because people just could not cope with the idea of a George W. Bush presidency.
Oh, my goodness. Maybe that was the Cheney family, who knows? Yeah, well, let's look at what you've just raised there, because halfway through your piece, it's a brilliant piece, you make reference to a number of, they would consider themselves public intellectuals. That's often a term used for people
What does that mean, by the way, just quickly?
Yeah, well, look, I was going to ask you the same. I learnt that term at university, and I asked, what does it really mean, and I didn't get an answer, so I'm not sure.
I think, I prefer people who keep their intellectualism private. There's a lot of things that should be kept private, and intellectualism is one of them.
Well, I've often found so-called public intellectuals seldom display any sort of intellectual attributes, but that's another matter. But you make reference here to, say, Bob Ellis, Mike Carlton, and somebody, Ashraf, someone or other, whose surname really is beyond me, who have been rambling quite disgustingly, let's say, of late online. Run us through some of this. Bob Ellis, of course, we all know about, confidant of Bob Carr and all that. He's often found finger to keypad, but what's he been on about lately?
A lot of it's not repeatable on a station with such high standards as 2GB. A lot of it's four-letter words, a lot of it's abuse. He's got a website called Ellis Table Talks, I think, and almost every day he calls for people to be imprisoned for what he calls as the falsification of polling data.
All right.
By his estimate, and I'm not sure how he arrives at this, but by his estimate, Labor is currently polling at around 56.8% of the two-party preferred vote.
Oh, really? 56.8%.
He's long been looking forward to his predicted Labor landslide. But, I guess we've got to look back to some of his previous predictions. He also predicted, I think, a Labor victory in New South Wales in the last election, which was, he might have missed that by 1 or 2%.
He came close.
Yeah, and he did also predict that Campbell Newman wouldn't win his own seat in the Queensland election, which he also predicted would be a very tight race. And again, I'd have to check the records, he might have been out by 1 or 2%.
Just a bit, yeah. Just a couple of seats.
Yeah, Mike Carlton is on Twitter at the moment. He's the Sydney Morning Herald columnist.
He's also been rambling on, hasn't he?
In an inventive way for Mike, he came up with an idea last week to put up a satirical interview with Tony Abbott, whereby he invented dialogue with the opposition leader. I'm not sure it really worked. A lot of people took it to be an actual interview, so maybe his aim was a little astray.
Well, I had one lady email me off the top of the show on last Sunday morning saying, have you seen this interview Abbott's given to Carlton? If this gets out, his campaign's sunk.
Yeah.
They didn't quite pick the irony.
No, they didn't pick the irony. Sometimes Mike, his aim, as I said, might have been a little bit awry. But when your sort of argumentative tactic is to invent the words of your opponent, and that's basically what Carlton did. He literally tried to verbal him, I suppose, or not literally, but in print form, tried to verbal the opposition leader. It only works if there's more sort of truth to the personality you're trying to describe. So he was basically, inventing dialogue with the cartoon that the left believes Tony Abbott is, rather than any realistic portrayal of the man. And it was curious as well, because while Abbott criticised this mock, while Carlton criticised this mock Abbott in his bogus interview as being a sexist and a sort of a leering lecture type of person.
And a racist and everything else.
But the sexist stuff was fascinating, because you only have to go back 3 or 4 years to find columns by Carlton in which he basically used the same terms to describe his appreciation of Christina Keneally.
Yes.
So, you've got to watch out, Mike. The internet's got a long memory, even if you don't.
Certainly does. Well, some of the bits that you put in your piece here from Mike's imaginary little musings are telling, because you say that in Carlton's piece he says of Abbott, I've come a long way on homosexuals over the years, although I still wouldn't want to be in a dunny alone with a homo, but I wouldn't think of punching them out anymore. Earlier on, I think he wrote something along the lines of, look at your wogs and lebs. They used to run fish shops and kebab joints. These days, many of them are going to uni. Imagine if a so-called public intellectual of the right, let's say Graham Morris and Alan Jones, a Ron Walker, you, someone like that, was to
Did you just accuse me of being a public intellectual?
Well, look, in the nicest term, a public
might be the first ever on-air lawsuit.
A public intellectual of the right. Now, I've made there's a caveat there, but seriously, imagine if somebody of that imaginary ilk, let's say, of the right, mused like this you'd have Penny Wong frothing at the mouth, you'd have Tanya Plibersek having kittens. It would be probably curtains on the campaign.